The Earth came about through evolution. The Ice Age ended and new pathways were revealed through which the Native Americans traveled and settled. The Incans settled in Peru, the Mayans in Central America, and the Aztecs in Mexico. Agriculture supported the new Americans and turned them from nomads to settled agricultural villages. The lifestyles the Indians led were peaceful, and they lived off the land. Norse explorers accidentally discovered and settled Maine area in AD 1000, but it was forgotten. In 1450, Portuguese explored Africa and started the slave trade. Columbus found India, America, in 1492. Columbus claimed the Americas for Spain and divided it between Portugal with the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. In the 1500s, Cortez found the Aztec civilization and the chieftain Moctezuma. With his fall came the rise of the Spanish Empire. The new race of Spanish people traveled and spread out in the New World to conquer and claim before other countries did. The lust for gold, furs, and new commodities did not wane, but as fewer resources were found, the Spaniards found a new hobby: Christianization. Those who had religion unwelcomely imposed on them revolted, killing many Spaniards, but they too regained control about 50 years later. The southern part of America was inhabited and growing during the 1500s, while the northern area was mostly untouched. In 1607, the English colony in Jamestown, Virginia was established, with the French settlement in Quebec established in 1608. The Spanish created a colony in Santa Fe in 1610. Because of the Protestant Reformation in England in the 1530s, Catholic Spain and Protestant England competed with each other. The first English settlement was not Jamestown, but rather Roanoke, North Carolina, but it disappeared without a trace. Meanwhile, Spain prepared to battle the English and made it to the English Channel, but were defeated. By the early 1600s, Spain and England had peace. The Jamestown colony started out as an utter failure, as most settlers died of disease and/or malnutrition. Captain John Smith saved the colony with new rules and his leadership in 1608, right after being kidnapped by Indians and mock executed. The Indian chief Powhatan had wanted to display and prove his power. Pocahontas, the chief's daughter, was the go-between for both sides, and she helped establish peace as well as supply food for the starving colonists. Still, the settlers died. Of the 400 who arrived in 1609, only 60 were alive in 1609 to 1610. A new leader, Lord De La Warr, arrived in 1610 and effectively ended the peace treaty between Indians and white colonists. The first Anglo-Powhatan War was in 1614 and was settled temporarily with Pocahontas' marriage to colonist John Rolfe. The second Anglo-Powhatan War started in 1644 and ended any hope of reconciliation. Powhatan's braves were no match for a trained English army, and the Indians' numbers were drastically reduced as well as scattered. John Rolfe started the tobacco industry in 1612, and the colonists went wild trying to keep up with the demand for more from England. Shortly after, King James I took back exclusive control of the Jamestown settlement in 1624. A new settlement was created in Maryland by Catholic Lord Baltimore in 1634. This settlement also grew because of tobacco, and it harbored many persecuted Catholics under the 1649 Act of Toleration, which protected all who agreed that Jesus is divine. Spain's own internal conflicts led to the collection of Jamaica to the American colonies in 1655. The cash crop here was sugar. In the 1700s, the slave trade had grown extensively to support the production of sugar. A new colony sprung up in Carolina with rice as its major export. Martin Luther disagreed with the Catholic Church and posted his thesis to the door of Wittenberg's cathedral in 1517. This paved the way for the Protestant Reformation. A religious leader named John Calvin started Calvinism, the belief that God ordained certain people to be saved and some to be damned. This became the doctrine of the Puritans, Scottish Presbyterians, French Huguenots, and communicants of the Dutch Reformed Church. King Henry VIII rebelled against the Roman Catholic Church in the 1530s. Puritans were not pleased that non-Purists could go to church with Purists, and so broke away further and became Separatists. Separatists were bothersome to Scottish King James I, and so they fled to Holland in 1608. Rejecting the Dutchification of their children, the 102 separatists went to America on the Mayflower in 1620. By 1621, only 44 were alive, but they didn't give up. In 1629, a group of non-separatist Puritans secured a royal charter to create the Massachusetts Bay Company. They created a colony in Boston, Massachusetts, and John Winthrop became their first governor. A colonist named Anne Hutchinson started the belief that those truly saved do not need to follow God's or man's laws, antinomianism. She was tried in 1638 and was banished. Another dissenter named Roger Williams was supposed to be banished to England, but instead started a colony in Rhode Island in 1636 that practiced religious tolerance. Anne Hutchinson and many other dissenters went to this colony, eventually nicknamed Rogues Island. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the separatist Pilgrims made a tentative treaty in 1621 with the Native Americans. In 1643, a group of 4 colonies banded together and created the New England Confederation. The Dominion of New England had a leader named Sir Edmund Andros, who was very harsh and did not allow many privileges to the citizens and heavily taxed out consent. The Glorious Revolution in England overthrew James II and replaced him with his daughter Mary and her husband William. When the Americans heard of the success, they attacked Andros. A young Quaker named William Penn started a colony in 1681 with a grant from the king and named it Penn's Woodland. The nearby natives were very friendly and trusted. The Chesapeake Bay Colony grew extremely weak, and many settlers died before their 20th birthdays. By the early 1700s, the population was growing as the survivors acquired immunities. Tobacco production continued to increase, but there were not enough laborers for all the fields, and this started the process of indentured servitude. At first, being an indentured servant seemed like a great option rather than starving, but as the time wore on, the benefits dwindled down until freed servants had to work for their former masters for next to nothing. In 1676, these servants did something about the situation. Led by Nathaniel Bacon, they attacked the Indians, treated better by the government than the immigrants, chased Governor Berkeley from Jamestown, and burned the capital. When Bacon fell sick and died, Berkeley crushed the rebellion and hung 20 rebels. Bacon's rebellion was over, but there was still much tension, and landholders soon looked to Africa for slaves. These slaves had worse conditions than indentured servants and tried rebellions and revolts, but none compared to Bacon's rebellion. In Massachusetts, Harvard College was established in 1636. Although life expectancies increased and families lasted longer and stayed together, the Puritan separatists' beliefs started weakening. Churches started allowing non-elect to attend. This started the Salem witch trials, where 20 died, as well as 2 dogs, for their crime, or innocence, of witchcraft. By 1775, Britain actually ruled 32 colonies, not just the 13 in the Americas. The original 13 are just the colonies that rebelled first. Those 13 colonies outnumbered England 3-1 in 1775. Immigrants came from all over for sorts of reasons. Ministers and those involved in the church had the most respected jobs with doctors and lawyers. Very unrespected. Craftsmen and women and artisans were valued as well as resources. As Britain continued claiming resources, the bitterness from the colonies grew. Money grew tight, and so to earn more, colonists started trading with the French and other people rather than just Britain. To stop this, English Parliament passed the Molasses Act in 1733. This did not work. Americans just went around the law. The 2 major churches that were tax-supported were the Anglican and Congregational. Clergy for the Anglican Church were less spiritual, and William and Mary College was founded in 1693 to fix this. In the 1730s and 40s, the Great Awakening spread like wildfire after its ignition in Northampton, Massachusetts, by Pastor Jonathan Edwards. Colleges sprung up to teach literacy, so Bible reading could be done personally. Male education became very common to train them as clergy. In the early 1600s, France's Louis XIV began to explore Canada and America through Samuel de Champlain, the father of New France. Beaver pelts were common trade goods in the Canadian settlements, and the Jesuits did their best to convert the natives around them. The French continually built settlements to block the expansion of other nations. In fact, Louisiana, New Orleans, was used to block the Spanish. King William's and Queen Anne's wars were fought between the French and British. The Treaty of 1713 was signed to end those conflicts. The War of Jenkins' Ear was between the British and Spanish in 1739. George Washington started the French and Indian War in 1754, and it was fought worldwide. Also in 1754 was the Albany Congress. Originally, it was about how to protect the British in America from the Iroquois, but it really was the first attempt at intercolonial unity. William Pitt was brought forward in Britain's time of need and became the organizer of victory against the French. He captured Louisbourg in 1758, and James Wolfe helped him take down Quebec. The colonists had a new sense of freedom and started to resent the British. The proclamation of 1763, prohibiting settlement past the Appalachian Mountains, angered the colonists as they illegally traveled west. Only one of the original 13 colonies, Georgia, was actually created by the British government. Nonetheless, the English government took control of all 13 through mercantilism. The colonists' welfare was sacrificed for the good of the British, and it is through many acts like this that the colonists began to resent Mother Britannia. According to Theodore Roosevelt, revolution broke out because Britain failed to recognize an emerging nation when it saw one. Thanks to the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War, Britain needed to pay off her debts. Prime Minister George Grenville tried to pay the debts with the 1763 navigation laws, as well as the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Quartering and Stamp Acts of 1765. The Stamp Act Congress met in 1765 to repeal this act, and the war cry became "No taxation without representation." This, as well as the non-importation agreements, united the colonists. Although the Stamp Act was eventually repealed, the Declaratory Act was passed soon after. The Townshend Acts were passed in 1767, and failure to comply with the law led to the quartering of rowdy troops. This led to their torment by the colonists, which included throwing snowballs with a brick in the middle. The troops opened fire, and thus was the Boston Massacre. The tea tax was not repealed, and a group of Bostonians led by Paul Revere had the Boston Tea Party in 1773. In 1774, the Boston Port Act, part of the so-called Intolerable Acts, was passed to punish the Boston Tea Party. The First Continental Congress met in 1774 to address the colonists' grievances. Many wars broke out with blacks fighting on both sides. The war became about principle, and reconciliation was no longer possible. The Second Continental Congress met in 1775 and appointed George Washington to head the army attacking Boston. With many other skirmishes, finally came to the Olive Branch Petition in 1775 to patch things up with Britain, but George III would have none of it. He formally declared the rebellion of the colonies, even hiring German mercenaries. Americans were hurt, and writer Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense to remind them that it went against common sense for smaller Britain to rule larger America. Paine also called for a republic. Lee stated America's independence to the Philadelphia Congress on June 7th of 1776, and Thomas Jefferson finished the Declaration of Independence on July 2nd, 1776. Congress finished its edits on the 4th. But war was not over yet. In two of his most brilliant military strategies, Washington defeated the Hessians and a British detachment. The British were defeated at Saratoga in 1777 and virtually gave the colonists their freedom. But with the signing of the treaty between France and America in 1778, it was too late, and the Revolutionary War turned into a world war. After more manslaughter, the Treaty of Paris was signed by the British and Americans in 1783.